Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to clear the area. This is a restricted lane, and you're a safety violation waiting to happen. The words, spoken by a private who looked barely old enough to shave, were coated in a thick layer of condescending authority. A few other soldiers, lounging nearby on a stack of sandbags, chuckled into their fists. The woman in the plain gray t-shirt and dusty cargo pants didn't respond. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the distant heat haze shimmering over the tank trails, her posture one of unnerving stillness. She looked like a civilian contractor, maybe a lost dependent, someone utterly out of place amidst the disciplined chaos of Fort Independence. But from the shaded porch of the command building, 100 yards away, Command Sergeant Major Wallace saw something else. He saw the way she stood, not with the casual slump of a civilian, but with the subtle, ramrod alignment of a career soldier. Shoulders back, weight perfectly centered, a posture drilled into muscle memory by 1,000 formations. He saw the worn, faded memorial bracelet on her right wrist, a silent testament to a fallen comrade. And then his eyes caught the glint of a single, tiny, subdued metal star pinned almost invisibly to the collar of her unassuming shirt, a star so small it was designed not to be seen. If you believe true authority requires no announcement, type quiet below. The silence from the woman seemed to infuriate the young private even more. His partner, another fresh-faced soldier named Gable, stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Hey, you hear him?" He said, "Move. This is for official military personnel only. We've got live-fire drills starting up, and we can't be babysitting tourists." The word tourist was spat out like an insult. The woman's eyes finally shifted from the horizon, slowly panning to meet the private's. They were calm, shockingly so. There was no fear, no anger, not even annoyance. It was the dispassionate, analytical gaze of a geologist studying a rock. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence was a challenge, a quiet refutation of their entire worldview. To them, power was loud. It was shouted commands, shiny boots, and sharp creases. This woman was none of those things. She was a ghost, an anomaly, and their immature minds could only process this deviation as an act of defiance that required correction. The first private, Miller, took another step. "All right, that's it. I'm not getting my weekend pass revoked because some lady has a hearing problem." He reached out, his hand clumsy and aggressive, and shoved her shoulder. I said, "Move it." It wasn't a brutal push, but it was firm and disrespectful, designed to humiliate. She stumbled, her worn combat boots catching on the loose gravel, and for a moment, it looked like she would fall completely. Instead, she dropped with practiced control to one knee, her hand touching the ground to steady herself. The laughter from the other soldiers died in their throats, replaced by an awkward, tense silence. They had just watched two of their own physically assault a civilian woman. But the woman didn't cry out. She didn't protest. She simply remained on one knee for a long second, her head bowed as if in thought, before pushing herself back up with a smooth, fluid motion that spoke of incredible core strength. She brushed the dust from her pants, her movements economical and precise. Then she looked back at them, and her expression hadn't changed at all. It was still calm, still professional. And in that moment, that unnerving calm was more terrifying to the two privates than any scream or threat could ever be. They had expected tears or anger. They had not expected nothing. They had poked a hornet's nest, but the hornets weren't swarming. The Queen was just watching them, calculating. This was Colonel Evelyn Reed's third day at Fort Independence, and she had yet to set foot in her official office. Her change of command ceremony was scheduled for the end of the week, a formal affair of speeches and passing guidance. But Reed's philosophy of leadership was not forged in ceremony. It was hammered out in the dust of Kandahar and the mud of Mosul. A commander didn't learn their post from a briefing book. They learned it by walking the ground, by breathing the air, by feeling the rhythm of the place. So she walked, in unremarkable civilian attire. She had spent 72 hours observing. She watched the flow of traffic at the main gate before dawn, the efficiency of the chow hall lines during the lunch rush, the posture of the guards on the perimeter at midnight. She was a ghost, gathering data, forming a mental mosaic of her new command strengths and, more importantly, its weaknesses. The incident with the two privates was just another data point, albeit a significant one. It spoke of a breakdown in discipline, a pocket of arrogance that had been allowed to fester. She saw in their eyes the dangerous certainty of the ignorant, a belief that appearance was reality, that the absence of a uniform signified the absence of importance. It was the same fatal assumption that got convoys ambushed and patrols overrun. As she stood before them, a silent statue of composure, she was already formulating the necessary corrective actions, not out of anger, but out of a sense of profound duty. The well-being of the thousands of soldiers on this base was now her responsibility, and that included saving Privates Miller and Gable from their own worst instincts. She was about to finally speak, to ask for their names and unit, when a sound ripped through the air that changed the equation entirely. It was the sudden, violent roar of a straining engine, followed by a percussive thump and the screech of tortured metal. Everyone's head whipped towards the source of the noise. About 200 yards down the access road, a Humvee, part of a convoy conducting emergency maneuver drills, had swerved erratically. A simulated IED, nothing more than a concussive smoke charge, had detonated a little too close to the lead vehicle. The driver, a young specialist disoriented by the blast and the thick, billowing smoke, had overcorrected. The heavy vehicle lurched, its tires losing purchase on the gravel shoulder, and began a terrifying, uncontrolled skid directly toward a small group of soldiers who were observing the training for what they thought was a safe distance. They were frozen, their faces painted with a mixture of confusion and primal fear. It was a deer-in-the-headlights moment, a fatal pause that precedes tragedy. The world seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity of impending impact. The two privates who had just assaulted her were paralyzed, their mouths agape, their bravado vanishing like smoke in the wind. They were children again, terrified and useless in the face of genuine crisis. This was the moment where training either took over or failed completely. For them, it had failed. For Colonel Evelyn Reed, it was just another Tuesday. The tableau of panic was a familiar sight to Reed. She had seen it in the chaotic aftermath of firefights, in the frantic moments of a mass casualty event. Chaos was a constant. The only variable was the response. While everyone else remained frozen, trapped in the amber of shock, her mind was a whirlwind of cold, hard calculations. She processed the variables in a fraction of a second. The Humvee's velocity, its vector, the position of the soldiers, the terrain. Her brain was a targeting computer, and it had already identified the optimal solution. She didn't waste time shouting a warning that would never be heard over the engine's roar. She didn't run towards the vehicle in a futile attempt to stop it. She exploded into motion, a blur of gray and khaki against the dusty backdrop. Her sprint was not a panicked dash, but a controlled, powerful burst of speed, her arms pumping, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground. She wasn't running to where the soldiers were. She was running to where the Humvee was going to be. Her target was a young private, the one closest to the impact zone, who was staring at the oncoming vehicle with wide, uncomprehending eyes, his rifle held uselessly in his hands. He was completely locked up, a statue on the verge of being shattered. Reed reached him in a heartbeat. There was no time for gentle persuasion. She hit him with a flying form tackle, wrapping her arms around his waist, her shoulder driving hard into his center of mass. It was a textbook maneuver, executed with the brutal efficiency of a linebacker. She used her own momentum and his to propel them sideways, away from the direct path of destruction. They hit the ground hard, tumbling through the dirt and gravel in a chaotic roll. For a split second, the world was a dizzying collage of sky and earth. Then, with a deafening crash of metal on metal, the Humvee smashed through the concrete barrier exactly where the young soldier had been standing a mere second before. The impact sent shrapnel and dust flying through the air as the massive vehicle ground to a halt, its front end crumpled like a tin can. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the scene, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured radiator and the distant, frantic shouts of the training cadre. Every single person was staring, their minds struggling to process the sequence of events. They had witnessed an act of impossible speed and decisive violence, executed by the unassuming woman in the gray t-shirt. Privates Miller and Gable stood rooted to the spot, their faces pale with a dawning, horrified understanding. The woman they had dismissed, the tourist they had shoved, had just moved with the kind of lethal grace and battlefield instinct that they had only ever seen in training films. She had reacted not like a civilian, but like a predator. The arrogance that had defined them moments ago was gone, scoured away by the raw display of competence they had just witnessed. Miller could only manage a choked whisper, a question directed at no one and everyone. Who is she? The question hung in the thick, dusty air, a testament to their shattered assumptions. On the ground, Colonel Reed untangled herself from the day's private. Her first priority was triage. "Are you hurt? Can you move everything?" she asked, her voice calm and authoritative, cutting through his shock. He mumbled a response, still trying to process his near-death experience. Reed performed a quick check for injuries, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat lifesaver, checking his neck, his limbs, his breathing. She was all business, her focus entirely on the soldier in her care. She was a commander, and this was one of her troops. That was all that mattered. The arrival of Command Sergeant Major Wallace was as inevitable as the sunrise. He strode onto the scene with a purpose that parted the growing crowd of onlookers. He was a legend on the post, a man whose service record stretched back to the First Gulf War. His face was a roadmap of deployments, and his eyes missed nothing. He had seen the entire event unfold from his vantage point, from the initial disrespectful shove to the final heroic tackle. His expression was thunderous, a storm cloud of righteous fury gathering on his brow. But he did not go to the crash site. He did not go to the training cadre, now sprinting towards the scene. He walked directly, unerringly, to Privates Miller and Gable. They flinched as he approached, visibly shrinking under his gaze. He stopped less than a foot in front of them, his shadow falling over them like a shroud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet, menacing timbre of his words was far more effective. "You too," he began, his voice a low growl. "Give me your names and your unit." Now they stammered out their information, their voices cracking with fear. Wallace just nodded slowly, filing the information away for the reckoning that was to come. Then he turned away from them as if they were beneath his notice and walked towards the woman who was now helping the young private she had saved to his feet. As he approached, his entire demeanor shifted. The fury vanished, replaced by a look of profound and unwavering respect. He stopped 3 paces from her, drew himself up to his full height, and executed the sharpest, most impeccably formal salute of his 30-year career. His hand sliced through the air, his arm ramrod straight, his eyes locked on hers. "Colonel Reed," he said, his voice ringing with authority and deference. "Welcome to Fort Independence. On behalf of the NCO Corps, I apologize for the unprofessional reception you have received." The world stopped. The word colonel detonated in the stunned silence, sending shockwaves through the assembled soldiers. Jaws literally dropped. Eyes widened in disbelief. Miller and Gable looked at each other, the color draining completely from their faces as the catastrophic reality of their actions crashed down upon them. They hadn't just shoved a civilian. They had assaulted their new base commander. They had put their hands on the one individual who held absolute authority over every single person, every single operation on the entire installation. The quiet woman in the gray t-shirt was the new king, and they had tried to throw her out of the castle gates. The full weight of the revelation settled upon the crowd. They were staring at a living legend, a ghost who had walked among them, and they had been utterly blind. The quiet observer, the unassuming woman, was Colonel Evelyn Reed, a name that was whispered with a mixture of awe and reverence in the highest echelons of the military. She was not just a commander. She was a warrior scholar, a leader forged in the crucible of the nation's most demanding conflicts. Command Sergeant Major Wallace, seeing the looks of utter confusion and dawning horror, decided the moment required a brutal, unforgettable lesson. He kept his salute held for a moment longer, a public display of fealty, before dropping his hand and turning to address the shell-shocked privates and the wider audience of soldiers. His voice was no longer a growl. It was the clear, sharp crack of a rifle, each word a perfectly aimed shot. For those of you who are clearly unable to recognize true leadership when it is standing right in front of you, he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing with crushing weight on Miller and Gable. Allow me to provide you with some illumination. He pulled a small, ruggedized tablet from his cargo pocket, his thumbs swiping across the screen with practiced familiarity. You two geniuses just physically assaulted Colonel Evelyn Reed. Let's review some of her career highlights, shall we? He held the tablet up as if reading from a sacred text. Graduate, United States Military Academy at West Point. Honor graduate, U.S. Army Ranger School. Sapper Leader Course. Airborne. Air Assault. He paused, letting the weight of those initial qualifications sink in. These were not mere check marks on a resume. They were brutal filters designed to weed out all but the most resilient and capable leaders. Her first command was a rifle platoon in the 101st Airborne Division during the initial invasion of Iraq. Awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor after leading a counterattack against an enemy ambush, another pause. He was building his case brick by painful brick. She later volunteered for special operations, serving 3 combat tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment. It was during her second tour that she was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The mention of the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest award for combat valor, caused a collective intake of breath. It was an award that separated soldiers from legends. She led her Rangers on a night raid against a high-value target, and when her unit was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire, then Captain Reed single-handedly flanked the enemy position and eliminated it, saving the lives of at least a dozen of her men. Wallace looked up from the tablet, his eyes boring into Miller and Gable. The woman you just shoved to the ground has seen more combat than your entire platoon combined. She has forgotten more about soldiering than you will ever know. Her last assignment before this was at the Pentagon as a direct liaison to the Joint Special Operations Command. Mission classifications, top secret. Her file is filled with blacked-out commendations for actions we are not even clear to know about. He lowered the tablet, the silence now absolute. She is, without exaggeration, one of the most respected combat leaders of her generation. And you, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft whisper, you put your hands on her. You judged her by her clothes, not by her character. You saw a woman, not a warrior. You have not only failed as soldiers today, you have failed as human beings. You have disgraced yourselves, your unit, and this installation. And I promise you, you will learn the meaning of the word respect before I am through with you. Colonel Reed finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with an undeniable authority that commanded immediate attention. Sergeant Major, she said, her tone even and calm. See to the driver of that vehicle. Get a full report on what happened. And take these 2 privates to my temporary office. I will speak with them there. She gave a curt nod, a gesture of dismissal that was more powerful than any tirade. Her orders were simple, direct, and left no room for interpretation. She then turned her attention back to the young soldier she had saved, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Let's get you to the medics, son. We need to make sure you're 100% in that moment. She defined her command philosophy for all to see. The mission first, secure the scene. Then, take care of the troops. Ensure the well-being of the soldier. Finally, address the discipline issue. Deal with the failure. It was a masterclass in leadership, delivered not in a classroom, but in the chaotic aftermath of a crisis. As CSM Wallace marched the 2 mortified privates away, their careers flashing before their eyes, the story began to spread. It moved with the speed of digital gossip, jumping from phone to phone, from mouth to mouth. By the time evening chow began, the tale of the quiet woman in the gray t-shirt was already the stuff of legend. It was told in hushed, reverent tones in the barracks, dissected with analytical admiration by the NCOs in their mess, and discussed with a sense of awe by the officers in their quarters. The narrative was perfect, almost mythic. The unassuming hero, the arrogant fools, the sudden crisis, the impossible act of bravery, and a shocking reveal. Every soldier who heard it felt a vicarious thrill of vindication. The story wasn't just about a new commander. It was a powerful parable about the core values they were all supposed to uphold. It was a story about how competence is quiet, how arrogance is loud, and how in the moments that matter, actions are the only things that speak the truth. The legend of Colonel Reed's arrival was being cemented into the institutional memory of Fort Independence, and she hadn't even had her official change of command ceremony yet. The two privates, Miller and Gable, stood at rigid attention in a Spartan, temporary office. The only furniture was a metal desk and 3 chairs. Colonel Reed sat behind the desk, now dressed in a crisp Army combat uniform. The rank of a full colonel, a silver eagle, gleamed on her chest, along with rows of ribbons that told the story of a life lived at the sharp end of the spear. The silver star, the bronze star with its V device, the purple heart, they were all there, a silent, damning indictment of the private's foolishness. She didn't speak for a full 5 minutes. She just sat there, looking at them, her calm, analytical gaze peeling back their layers of bravado and fear, exposing the scared young men beneath. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of anger. It was worse. It was disappointed. "Tell me," she began, her words precise and measured, "what is the 7th Army value?" Gable stammered, "Respect, ma'am." "And what does that word mean to you, Private?" she asked. Miller, finding a sliver of courage, spoke up. "Treating people as they should be treated, Colonel, precisely," Reed said with a nod. "And as they should be treated is not contingent upon their rank, their uniform, or their gender. It is a universal standard. You failed to apply that standard today. You failed it not just for me, but for the uniform you wear. You assumed. And in our profession, assumptions get people killed." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto theirs. "Your punishment will not be extra duty mopping floors. That is too easy. Your punishment will be to learn. You will each write a 5,000-word essay on the principle of respect, citing historical examples of how a lack of it has led to military disaster. You will then read that essay aloud to every platoon in your battalion. You will stand before your peers, and you will own your failure. You will become living examples of why we do not judge people by their appearance. Am I understood?" Both privates snapped back, their voices united in a chorus of chastened understanding. "Yes, Colonel." The ripple effects of that day spread far and wide, fundamentally altering the culture of the base. The story became a teaching tool, a piece of living folklore. New soldiers arriving for in-processing were told the tale of Reed's Corner, the spot where the commander, on her first day, saved a life moments after being treated with utter disrespect. The story served as a potent and immediate lesson. At Fort Independence, you checked your assumptions at the main gate. Competence came in all shapes, sizes, and genders, and true authority didn't need to be loud. Colonel Reed's command was transformative. She led with a quiet, unshakable confidence that inspired loyalty and excellence. She was often seen walking the base, not in a staff car surrounded by aides, but alone, observing, talking to the lowest-ranking soldiers, asking them about their equipment, their training, their families. She remembered names. She understood their challenges. She was a commander of the soldiers, not just of the command. Her leadership was defined by a simple, powerful philosophy. Standards are set at the top, but they are maintained at the bottom. She empowered her NCOs, trusted her junior officers, and demanded excellence from everyone, most of all from herself. The base, once considered a sluggish training post, became a model of efficiency and high morale. The change was palpable. Privates Miller and Gable became the most profound examples of this transformation. The public humiliation of reading their essays was a crucible that burned away their youthful arrogance. They were humbled but not broken. Colonel Reed had given them a chance to learn and recover, not just to be punished. They took the lesson to heart. They became exemplary soldiers, known for their discipline, their work ethic, and above all, their profound sense of respect for everyone they encountered. 6 months after the incident, Colonel Reed was observing a rifle qualification range when she saw Private Miller mentoring a new recruit who was struggling with his marksmanship. Miller was patient, encouraging, and respectful. After the recruit had successfully qualified, Reed approached him. "You're a good teacher, Private Miller," she said. Miller snapped to attention, his face flushing. "Thank you, Colonel. I had a good teacher." The moment was a quiet testament to the enduring power of a lesson well learned. The symbolic artifact of the day wasn't a plaque or a monument. It was a culture. It was the way a sergeant would now correct a young soldier for being dismissive to a civilian contractor. It was the way a lieutenant would take the time to listen to the concerns of a private. The legacy of Reed's first day was woven into the very fabric of Fort Independence, a constant reminder that strength is often silent, and respect is the currency of true leadership. It was a story not of one commander's triumph, but of an entire institution's renewal, a renewal built on the simple but powerful idea that you should never, ever judge a book by its cover. A year passed. Fort Independence was no longer just a base, it was a standard. It was the post that other commanders sent their own leaders to in order to observe how a high-functioning, motivated, and disciplined organization was run. The secret, they would discover, was not some complex new management theory. It was the relentless, daily application of basic principles, championed by a commander who embodied them completely. Colonel Reed had instilled a philosophy of quiet professionalism that permeated every level of the command. The change was most evident in the small things. The grounds were immaculate, not because of threats of punishment, but because of a shared sense of ownership. The training exercises were more rigorous and realistic, because soldiers understood that their commander had walked in their boots and knew the difference between performative training and genuine preparation. The chow halls were cleaner, the barracks better maintained, the sense of purpose sharper. It was a command built on mutual respect, a respect that flowed down from the commander and was reflected back up from the lowest ranks. The story of her arrival had now become institutionalized, told by Command Sergeant Major Wallace himself during the orientation brief for all new arrivals. He would stand before the fresh-faced soldiers, his voice resonating with the weight of experience, and he would point to a framed photograph on the wall. It was a candid shot, taken by a soldier with a phone moments after the Humvee crash. It showed Colonel Reed, still in her dusty gray T-shirt, kneeling on the ground, her hand on the shoulder of the soldier she had just saved, her expression one of intense focus and concern. "Look at this picture," Wallace would say to the newcomers. "You see a woman in civilian clothes. Some of you might see someone who doesn't belong. What I see is a leader. I see a warrior. I see the commander of this installation in her natural element, taking care of her soldiers in a moment of crisis. Let this be your first and most important lesson at Fort Independence. The person standing next to you, regardless of their rank or what they are wearing, might be the one who saves your life one day. Treat them with respect. The quietest person in the room is often the one you should be listening to the most. Here, we judge people by the content of their character and the quality of their competence. Everything else is just noise." His speech always ended the same way, with a look that dared any of them to misunderstand his point. The legend of that day was no longer just a story, it was doctrine. It was the founding myth of the new Fort Independence, a moral compass for every soldier who served there. It was a constant, powerful reminder that true authority is not taken, but earned. It is earned in moments of crisis, in acts of quiet courage, and in the unwavering commitment to the well-being of others. The legacy of a leader is not measured in the monuments they build, but in the standards they leave behind. It's found in the behavior of their soldiers long after they have moved on to their next assignment. Years later, long after Colonel Evelyn Reed had been promoted to general and had left Fort Independence for a new command, the culture she had built endured. The story of her first day was still told, a foundational piece of the base's identity. It had become a parable, a touchstone for what it meant to be a soldier at that post. Privates Miller and Gable, now Sergeants Miller and Gable, were two of the finest NCOs in their brigade. They were known as leaders who were tough but fair, demanding but compassionate. They were especially known for taking new, arrogant privates under their wing and patiently, firmly, teaching them the lessons they themselves had learned the hard way. They never spoke of that fateful day with shame, but with a strange sense of gratitude. It was the worst day of their military careers, but it was also the most important. It was the day they stopped being boys playing soldier and started the long, hard journey of becoming men. They were living proof that a single moment of profound, humbling education can change a person's trajectory forever. The true impact of Colonel Reed's leadership was in these quiet, unseen moments of mentorship, repeated thousands of times over across the installation. Her legacy wasn't a bronze plaque. It was a living, breathing culture of professionalism and respect. It was in the sergeant correcting his soldier, in the lieutenant listening to his platoon, in the steady, quiet competence that had become the defining characteristic of the soldiers of Fort Independence. The ultimate lesson was clear. Authority is not about the rank on your collar or the volume of your voice. It is a quiet confidence, a moral clarity that reveals itself not in speeches, but in action. It is the calm hand in the chaos, the steady voice in the storm. True legacy isn't the story of what you did, but the standard of behavior that continues in your absence, a silent, powerful force that shapes the next generation of leaders. The greatest leaders do not need to announce their presence. Their competence speaks for them, echoing long after they are gone. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance and where character defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.